we've developed a plan. Is that plan being implemented? Our I's being dotted, our T's being crossed? And I hold my team accountable to a high standard. I work with the EOD teams in the morning to make sure that they're conducting their sweeps, and we swept the finish line 2 times before the bombs went off, but 2 times before the race started, and several times throughout the course of the event. There is no police chief in the United States of America who takes bombings more seriously than me. And I took them more seriously than any police chief in the United States of America prior to April 15, 2013. Because on October 28, 1991, I responded to a scene for an officer down. When I got to that scene, one of our officers, one of our bomb technicians, had been examining a device. That device was thought to be fake, and as he examined it, it exploded. It ripped his body apart, and he was gravely injured. And we packed him up in an ambulance and took him to Brigham Women's Hospital. I helped pack him up in the ambulance, and we got him to the hospital where my wife was an emergency room nurse. That police officer was Jeremiah J. Hurley, my best friend's dad. One of the reasons I became a cop. So I took the threat of bombings very seriously. I saw what it did physically to his body, and I saw what it did to that family for years to come with missed birthdays, weddings, anniversaries, and births of grandchildren. We swept the route that morning both times. I went out and shook all my officers' hands. The route comes in from Newton into Boston, comes in for about 1.5 miles, goes through Brookline for about 3 miles, then comes back into Boston. The lead runners come in, nothing was a problem. The governor left, all the VIPs left, and I thought we were done for the day. I just had to shake some more hands. I went out to Brighton, I shook the rest of my officers' hands at Brighton, got back in my car, went to the last 1/2 mile. I went out 1 mile from the finish line. I had 1/2 mile to cover to see my officers. As I was walking that last 1/2 mile and shaking hands and thanking them, a man who's here helping protect you at this convention, Sergeant Detective Dan Keeler. If you know him and you've experienced him, he's a very serious man. He's a Vietnam veteran. He's a homicide detective. We've been through some significant events together. Dan Keeler does not get affected. He's very calm, cool, and collected, and in charge. I heard Dan Keeler on the radio screaming for help and assistance. In the chaos, hundreds of officers were keying their mics trying to describe what they saw in front of them, and I had no idea what we had on Boylston Street. But I knew that my friend Dan Keeler needed me there. I got out of the area. I ran as fast as I could to Fenway Park, Kenmore Square. The Red Sox had just beaten the Devil Rays with a walk-off home run, which meant that 36,000 fans had now exited onto our marathon course, in addition to the hundreds of thousands of fans who were already there. It was there that I learned that 2 explosions had rocked our finish line. I was hoping that they were electrical in nature and perhaps a natural problem, but I knew we were probably the victim of a terrorist attack. I got in a car and I drove to the scene. Dan Keeler got on that radio and ran that scene. Keeler knew from past experience that every police officer, every agent in the area was coming to help, and that's a good thing. The bad thing is that every police officer and every agent in the area was coming to help. Keeler got on the radio, he quarterbacked that scene along with a civilian dispatcher and made sure that no one blocked the street. He reminded every police officer, every firefighter to not block that street, and he implemented the emergency action plan that we briefed at 7 a.m. And we brought ambulances in and out and got personnel on scene there. I arrived on scene and I got out of my vehicle, and Sergeant Detective Dan Keeler came up to me and he said, "Chief, they hit us twice. They hit us twice, boss. They blew a device, and as people were fleeing away, they blew a second one in the path, boss. They hit us twice." And as Danny told me that, he stopped talking. And he made me it. And he wanted me to now be in charge of that scene because I had 5 stars on my shoulder. I thought he was doing a fine job. He should have just kept going. But as I looked at the scene, there was an 8-year-old little boy that the terrorists had placed a bomb behind. They had a lot of places to pick, and they picked the body of an 8-year-old boy. And that little boy was devastated. And there were several devastated people around him. There were limbs lying on the streets. There was a young Asian woman who was murdered along with Martin. And our city was rocked. And I didn't have it. I didn't have control of myself. I was in the basement. I didn't know what to do. I went over towards the little boy to see if I could maybe help him. The firefighters and medics had already been working him, and there was nothing I could do. I was tapped on the shoulder and made to come out in the middle of the street. I was trying to figure out what we could do, and I didn't have it. And there was a woman whose foot was gravely injured and hanging off. And I said, I can do something about that. And I grabbed the napkin and I ran over towards that. My officers were triaging people, tying tourniquets with their own belts. Men and women from the fire service and the EMS were in there standing to what we thought were secondary devices, working patients, refusing to leave the scene. Service members who had served our country and were there as civilians jumped across the street and began saving lives with belts and ties and tourniquets. I couldn't help that woman. I was grabbed by a state trooper and told, Chief, we need you in the middle of the street, and I was pissed. I told him to get his hand off of me, and I wasn't mad at the state trooper. He's a friend of mine. I was mad at myself for not being in charge. We were then able to get control of the scene, gave out information to the troops, this is what we're going to do, and I remembered that I needed to be a boss. And I got in the radio and gave some instructions. We're going to evac and transport. We're going to get these victims out of here. We're then going to sweep for additional devices. Then we will evacuate the bars and restaurants. And I need somebody up there to get on social media and tell the rest of the world what we have going on down here. The team at the Boston Police Department, Boston EMS, Boston Fire, and our civilians could not have responded better. Everyone was off this scene in 22 minutes. We transported 33 patients in police wagons and pickup trucks. Everyone who left the scene alive is alive today. We're going to stop at the Forum Restaurant. This is the site of Blast 1. This bomb was timed to be 12 seconds after the first device. Citizens were fleeing up the street this way when the secondary device went off in their path of flight.
I thought we would.
Are we going back to the hotel?
Yes, ma'am. This is en route back to the hotel. At 10 o'clock that night, I received a call from our congressman. The little boy was with his family. In an effort to save their lives, his father was injured with a severe injury to his leg and had his eardrums blown out. That's the restaurant right there where the little boy was murdered. His mother was gravely injured, had shrapnel to her eye and wound up losing her eye in surgery. His 7-year-old sister had her leg severed, and people saved her life by tying a tourniquet on her leg. And his 11-year-old brother was uninjured. St. Michael had a hand around him that day, and he was uninjured. Unfortunately, in an effort to save everybody, we sent them to different hospitals. We couldn't put people in the same, we triaged people. So the family was split up, and we had to process that crime scene, and we had to look for secondary devices and have our EOD teams conduct sweeps. Wait here for just a minute or two, and then we'll move to the next one. We also had to process that scene. In case somebody had built that bomb in Tajikistan and there was a fingerprint there, we were going to hold them accountable. But that meant that we had to leave that little boy's body on the streets of Boston. And the father found out that his son's body had not been recovered. He checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice, and he demanded to go get his son. I had ordered all of the police officers except our bomb techs off this street for their own personal safety. We're coming up to the finish line where Blast 1 was. The father went over to, the congressman called me to tell me that the father was intent on recovering his son's body, and that he had left the hospital against medical advice. He was on his way over to his wife, who was coming out of surgery at another hospital, and his intent was, after checking on her, to come here. I called the captain who was assigned to security at the scene and told him that he may have a father coming to retrieve his son's body. That captain is Francis Armstrong, and he told me, Chief, can you please tell him we never left? Captain Armstrong disobeyed my order. Captain Armstrong and 5 men took turns, standing 2 at a time at attention over the bodies of the young man and the young woman. Captain Armstrong told me that the men were United States Marines. He was mistaken. There was 1 United States Marine, 1 U.S. Navy member, 1 Coast Guard member, and the other 2 were civilians. Upon hearing that information, the captain told me that they were going to stay with the little boy, and they were going to escort him off the scene with the medical examiner take him to the ME's office, and they would bring the boy home, that no one was leaving him alone. I was able to get in touch with our priest, who was the family's parish priest. I told him that information. He met with Mr. Richards as he went into his wife's recovery room. Mrs. Richards came out of her anesthesia, and the first words out of that mother's mouth were, "Where is my baby?" Her husband thought that she did not realize the significance of his wounds, and he informed her, "Denise, Martin is gone." And she said to him, "I know that Martin is gone, but where is my baby?" And he said, "I just spoke with Father Sean. There are Marines guarding him on Boylston Street, and they're going to stay with him." She reached for his hand, grabbed it, and said, "As long as my baby is not alone, I just want him not to be alone." Those men and women stayed guarding those victims till 1:30 in the morning, escorted those victims back to the morgue, and made sure that they were properly honored as we took them for the scene. We did an investigation, and we eventually identified the individuals. We put their pictures out on social media. You can't make this up, but we had identified 3 potential suspects at MIT that we had 24-hour surveillance on. They turned out not to be our terrorists, but our terrorists went to the place we had surveillance and murdered an MIT police officer in an effort to get his gun. The officer was slain while in his cruiser. They eventually carjacked an individual, drove him around. He escaped from custody. We learned of the carjacking and were able to GPS it. Officers from Watertown Police Department engaged the terrorists in a gun battle where they detonated devices similar to the devices they detonated on Marathon Day, which were remote controlled. We engaged them in a gun battle during which one of the MBTA police officers was wounded. Officers rushed to the scene. The officer with Donahue was shot in the femoral artery. Officers from several agencies were doing CPR and first aid on him. When I got to the scene, our officers were working on him, trying to save his life. I looked over to the left, and Tim Linskey was wrestling with one of the gang officers who you have here protecting you today, and a Watertown police officer still being put into custody. He was still fighting after being shot and run over by his brother. I ran over to Tim Linskey and I had a plan. I placed my Glock 40 caliber handgun to his temple, and I searched his body, which I was convinced would be contained in a suicide vest or a remote control detonation device. I searched with the intent of finding it and killing him. After finding him free of any such devices, I holstered my Glock 40 caliber handgun, and I grabbed a radio along with other officers, and we called for an ambulance. And we did first aid on the animal who murdered that little boy, 2 beautiful women, executed the police officer, engaged in a gun battle with our men, and tried to kill us. We did that because we're better than them, and that's why they hate us. We found the brother eventually in a boat after a long day where we shut down the city, and I cannot tell you how cooperative our citizens were when we asked them to give up their freedom and to stay in their house so that we could find the men responsible. They did. Brave men and women located him in the boat, surrounded him. He was taken into custody. He has been sentenced and punished by death. The individuals who helped him have been held accountable and have been sentenced as well. We did suffer another victim for the Marathon bombing attack. One of my officers who was in the gun battle with the Zanayev brothers had a bomb thrown at him and had a concussion from a head injury. Dennis fought back for 6 months and returned to duty. He was on duty for 30 days at the Boston Police Academy working out, trying to get back in shape, and he suffered an aneurysm which turned to be fatal.
Wow.
We were able, before I left as Chief of Police, to file a request with the medical examiner's office and others that they review the incidents in Watertown and the cause and nature of his death to determine if it may be related. They in fact found that Dennis Simmons was murdered by the Zanayev brothers as a result of his traumatic brain injury. And yesterday, the men and women of the Boston Police Department etched Dennis Simmons' name into our hallowed walls of those who have given their ultimate life for the Boston residents. It is my honor and privilege to be with you today and to share with you the heroics of the men and women that I had the privilege of working with every day. Thank you for listening, and thank you for coming to this great city.